Welcome to the Methow Valley Interpretive Center. Kunlit Kuchkich. The Methow Valley we see today has been shaped by millions of years of powerful forces. Take a walk through our exhibits. Explore this region's rich natural history, from ancient geology to flora and fauna and the valley's earliest human inhabitants. Discover the wonders of the Methow. Clouds of the Methow. The clouds that track overhead in the Methow Valley are as much a part of this place as the hardest granite spire. Influenced by extremes in elevation and temperature, as well as the complicated combination of marine, alpine, arctic, and desert inflows and weather systems, the variety of local cloud types that can be observed moving over the Methow Valley are remarkably varied and ever-changing. Emergence of the Methow, from ocean floor to icy peaks. According to legends of the Methow Indians, rocks are the oldest of living things. In the rocks all around us we can find ancient stories of the Methow, of its Sinpakchin, a traditional Salish word meaning dawn. Beneath the surface of today's Methow Valley, you may find a surprise. Seashell fossils such as extinct ammonites. These shells were alive tens of millions of years ago, during a time when the Methow lay beneath ocean waters. More recently, during a period known as the Ice Age, the Methow Valley was buried under a sea of glacial ice up to a mile deep. The ice movement carved U-shaped valleys, rounded the hills, and polished the bedrock. Between these periods of oceans and glaciers, the Methow Valley was squashed sideways, pushed upward, warped downward, eroded, and periodically covered over with sediments. The history of the Methow is colorful and complex, a story of emergence that continues to unfold. Methow's ocean beginnings. There were two periods during which the Methow lay beneath ocean waters. Marine remnants such as ammonite mollusk fossils can be found today in the Methow Valley. During the age of the dinosaurs, both ocean systems eventually filled in with sediments and became plant-lined river systems. The earliest rocks found in the Methow were deposited along a volcanic island chain between 160 and 130 million years ago. Called the Newby Group, these sediments rode along on the doughy mantle like a conveyor belt that descended down a subduction zone under North America, the Okanagan Core region. As the islands neared the Okanagan, the ocean sediments accumulated along the coast of North America. Uplift and downward warp. During this period, a new subduction zone formed. Mountains pushed up west of the Newby sediments, while the sediments warped downward to create a new deep ocean basin. Approximately 110 million years ago, the Newby sediments stopped moving. A new subduction zone had formed to the west. Everything between there and the Okanagan rocks was squashed together. Mountains pushed up west of the Newby sediments, and the sediments warped downward to create a new deep ocean basin. By about 95 million years ago, this ocean was entirely filled in with sediments. Plumes and faults. The mountains of granite surrounding the Methow Valley today formed from the crystallization of giant plumes of magma below the Earth's surface. Two deep cracks formed along each side of the basin's sediments, separating them from the uplifted crystalline plumes. Today we see mountains of granite surrounding the Methow Valley. These mountains formed from the slow crystallization of giant plumes of magma or plutons below the Earth's surface. Two deep parallel cracks had formed along each side of the basin's sediments, the Pasayten Fault and the Ross Lake Fault Zone. These faults separated the basin's sediments from the relatively uplifted crystalline plumes under the mountains. Erosion stripped away surface rocks, exposing the granite cores of the mountains we see today. Glacial sculpting. During the last 3 million years, ice sheets up to a mile thick have periodically advanced southward to the Methow Valley. As the ice advanced and retreated, it carved U-shaped valleys, rounded the hills, and polished the bedrock. Following the natural sculpting process, the shape of the Methow Valley looked much like it does today. The last glacial cycle, beginning approximately 25,000 to 18,000 years ago, created alpine glaciers that carved U-shaped valleys in all of the Methow Valley's high mountains. A few thousand years later, an ice sheet covered the entire valley except for the highest peaks, rounding the hills and polishing the bedrock. As the glaciers melted, huge volumes of meltwater funneled through the canyons, leaving boulder fields and remnant glacial drift and outwashed sediments in the valleys. During the Ice Age, the Cordilleran ice sheet covered more than half of Alaska and all of British Columbia. Only the highest peaks were visible above a field of ice that extended down into Washington, Idaho, and Montana. The largest lobe of this glacier, west of the North Cascades, covered Puget Sound. The Okanagan lobe, the second largest, buried the Okanagan and Methow valleys under ice approaching 5,000 feet thick. Nearly every feature of the valley we see today was modified over the millennia by the erosive forces of this massive continental ice sheet. The geologic story of the Methow Valley, its ancient stories, or Sinpakchen, can be told in the rocks beneath your feet as you walk along your favorite river section or hike your favorite trail, or those found here in the Methow Valley Interpretive Center. One such story is that of the Twist Winthrop boulder. This unusual boulder was found by a local resident just below the confluence of the Methow and Twist rivers. After being used for a doorstop for a few years, it was brought to the Interpretive Center. We wondered what it was and where it came from. Some thought it was so heavy, 20.6 pounds, and slightly magnetic that it might be a meteorite. The boulder took a trip to the University of Washington, where two specialists drilled a small rock core from the bottom of the rock and prepared a very thin slice for examination. The rock was found to be a meta-gabbro, and it contained small amounts of magnetite, which account for the rock's magnetic characteristics. Rocks that have been transported great distances by long-vanished glaciers are scattered on the hillsides of the Methow Valley and are called glacial erratics. Some of the characteristics of this boulder indicate that it probably isn't from a local source, which means that it may be an erratic brought from Canada by the Cordilleran ice sheet at the end of the Ice Age, perhaps 18,000 years ago. If this boulder could speak, it would tell an amazing tale. Curious about the earth deep beneath your feet? Dig down a bit and discover the amazing story in the sedimentary rocks from a time when the plants and dinosaurs lived. The Methow Valley has the most diverse record of preserved botanical plant fossils in the West, with 145 different species spanning 100 million years of time. Fossils, ancient storytellers. From ancient ocean floor to long, dry riverbeds, fields, forests, and rugged mountains, fossils offer us a picture book of stories, a real-time glimpse into the past. Could the Methow Valley have looked like this 100 million years ago? Spectacular fossil beds near Mazama once grew in a rich mix of ferns, palm-like cycads, and broadleaf flowering plants, suggesting that the area might have supported subtropical rainforests. Ribbon of life. It swirklun huelhultan tet. Water gives us life. Everyone lives in a watershed. All areas of land eventually drain water into a lake, river, or ocean. Watersheds provide important habitat for many plants and animals. The Methow River's watershed's many different habitats include rivers, lakes, wetlands, forests, even alpine tundra. The wetlands of the Methow River are a hidden treasure. Amid the high peaks, deep forests, and cold streams of the Methow watershed, wetlands such as marshes and ponds are tucked away, providing critical habitat for many organisms. Wetlands store water and sediment. Over time, they will spring forth a forest or a meadow. Some of the most outstanding wetlands in the Methow are nestled along the Methow River or adjacent to lowland lakes. What makes the Methow River such a healthy place for so many fish? Let's meet some of its inhabitants and find out. Bull trout require cold, clean water to survive. Because they are sensitive, their very presence illustrates the Methow River's good water quality. Pacific lamprey. During its life cycle, this anadromous fish requires a variety of substrates found in the Methow watershed, from sand and silt to coarser gravels, cobbles, and boulders. The bridge-lipped sucker. Preferred by this fish, the Methow watershed's smaller rivers provide both the pools favored in the daytime and the shallower runs sought during the night. The mottled sculpin. Methow River's swifter water sections provide cold, clean, oxygenated water as well as coarse gravels and cobbles preferred by the sculpin. The long-nosed dace. This fish favors the coarse gravel and cobble substrate in the shallower runs of the Methow River, as well as its cold, clean, well-oxygenated water. The red-band trout. The Methow River provides a variety of habitats suitable for the red-band trout, although adults prefer its larger, more turbulent sections and rocky substrate. The mountain whitefish. Primarily bottom feeders, these fish may migrate seasonally and can adapt to a variety of stream habitats while favoring deeper pools and runs. And the Chinook salmon. The Methow River's healthy riparian vegetation provides shade, helping to maintain cool water temperatures necessary for Chinook salmon to thrive. Achpatast. We honor water because it sustains life, in the Methow dialect or Insulting of the Salish language. A living landscape. The Methow Valley is rich with life. From the rocks and soil beneath your feet to the tops of the trees, and from the valley floor to the highest mountains, this region is home to a wide variety of fauna and flora. This diversity challenges us to be thoughtful stewards of the plants and animals that share this space with us. Flora. Some culturally important plants native to the Methow Valley. In the upper left, western spring beauty, or squinquinium, found at mid to high elevations in open, moist, grassy slopes, among deciduous shrubs or in areas of late snowbeds. They are dug in spring just after flowering. The leaves are a source of vitamin C and A. The corms taste like potatoes when cooked and are an important source of carbohydrates. Each plant has a tiny tuber below ground that is edible raw or cooked. Flowers and leaves are also edible raw. Lower center, bitterroot, spitlum, formerly found along both sides of the Methow River between Twisp and Winthrop. Flowers only open in the sun. Roots are edible and are dug with a digging stick after the leaves have appeared but before flowers develop. Otherwise, the roots become bitter. Roots are peeled and cooked or dried for winter use. It was considered a valuable plant historically and figured prominently in trade. Lewis and Clark reported that the prepared root was still too bitter, and hence it was called bitterroot. Upper right, balsam root. Metxu. Sunflowers abundant in the Methow Valley cover sunlit hills. All parts are edible, roots, stalk, and seeds. Women would beat seeds, or metxu, into birch bark baskets tied at the waist. Dried seeds might be kept for years and then pounded into flour, mixed with deer grease or dried service berry as a treat. Smaller roots are beaten and peeled and then steamed or baked. The young shoots and bud stems are edible in early spring. Lower right, serviceberry, shea. Widespread and common in the Methow Valley at low to mid elevations. It provides winter browse for many hoofed animals, and many bird species eat the berries in August. Berries are eaten fresh or dried in cakes or like raisins for storage. The dried berries in the past were a common trading item. Methow seasonal food cycle, following the stars, following the seasons. Did you know that the Methow region's earliest humans followed the stars, the Big Dipper in particular, in their search for food? As it moved seasonally through the sky, this familiar constellation helped to guide the Methow Indians toward the plants whose roots, leaves, fruits, and seeds were ready to gather. The seasonal movement of the stars also provided integral guidance for hunting and fishing. This constellation, the Big Dipper, is known as Klanaskit, grizzly bear in the sky. Following the seasons, Attili Tamtwa spring. February is the time of buttercup. We know spring is coming and need to make last-minute repairs to be ready. March is when the sunflowers appear. The shoots and bulbs were eaten raw. After blooming, the seeds were gathered and put into a pounder, which was then made into a powder. This we called Metxu. This was used to flavor food, and if eaten alone, you had to sit very still, or one would choke on this very fine dust. March is also known for when the leaves start to bloom on the trees. Starting with months of March through April, after a long and sometimes very hard winter, the Indians hunted for bear just coming out of hibernation. This was the time the bear was said to be in pretty good shape. This would be only overnight trips. They usually did not need overnight trips for brown and black bear. The bear was trapped with the deadfall traps. The last part of April, they trapped for suckers, lamprey, that were running at the time. This was located just below Oroville at the falls in the canyon. Families would gather and work traps. The traps were worked for about 2 to 3 weeks, getting enough to last them until the salmon started running in the month of June. Steelhead trout was caught in the Sandpoil near Keller, Washington, and from there the Indians traveled to Kettle Falls for the salmon camps. These camps were run by salmon chiefs, who were the ones who kept the peace. By April and May, the families who were left at the winter homes would then leave for the Bitterroot country. Some would go to the Camas lands and dig for their root supply. These are the most popular roots dug in the prairies. One could also hunt marmots there. Summer. June through July, they continued digging for camas in the Camas lands. Many went to the Wenatchee Valley. They watched for the white blossoms of the camas plant and also watched for the blue flowers of Itwa, or the dark camas. Other plants were wild carrots, wild potatoes, wild onion, tiger lily, cattail, wild celery, and pine nuts. Some berries that ripened early were gathered. Serviceberry was the main berry. The early berries were gathered and dried and sometimes pounded for flavor for other foods. My mother said that 2 kinds of blackberries were picked late in the summer. They picked wild raspberries, black raspberries, thimbleberries, elderberries, wild strawberries, wild loganberries, wild currants, rose hips, yellow coyote berries, thornberries, foamberries, our Indian ice cream, chokecherries, and huckleberries. These foods were available during the months of June through October. All foods were taken back to their camps and processed. They also hunted for animals such as deer, bear, and rabbit. The largest season for the different bands, the Wenatchee, Chelan, Eniat, Okanagan, Methow, and other bands east of us, was the running of the salmon. This also occurred during the months of June through October. All summer camps were located around the fishing places in the rivers where the salmon ran. July through August was the fall time, gathering time for all Indians to give thanks to the Creator for all they had and had taken from Mother Earth. Fall hunting season. October through November is the final cycle as far as preparing food supplies. The repairs are being done to their pit homes and other lodges, getting them ready for the winter months. They usually had 5 campsites picked out, and the families wintered together. They moved to the next camp when the firewood ran out, or maybe the hunting gets poor at one location, so they moved to the next one. In October came the big hunting season for deer and goats and sheep. Meat was brought back to the camps, the game. The women prepared it and dried all the game. The women would do the last of the digging or gathering of moss. They collected cedar for making more baskets or repairing the damaged ones. This was done while waiting for the hunters to return from hunting trips. Skilled hunters, armed with double curved or flat bows made of various types of wood, would hunt for game. They hunted bear, goat, deer, elk, geese, ducks, grouse, and sage hens, rabbit, beaver, cougar, marmot, squirrel, mink, marten, weasels, and fawns. The skins were prepared by the women. Some traveled to distant lands to take in the buffalo hunts, but not all would go. From the hides of the deer, elk, or other large animals, the clothing and covers were made. Robes from the buffalo they got from buffalo hunts or trade. Winter season. By November, the people started settling into the areas where their winter homes were going to be located. Winter homes were made several ways. Pit homes were circular and dug into the ground, covered with tule mats and dirt placed over poles. Tule longhouses usually housed several families. In the winter, families stayed together. If supplies were not plentiful, the men would hunt in the winter for deer and other animals to help get them through the winter. The salmon was the most popular food and was dried and stored for the winter. It was only kept 1 year. Any longer and the salmon would get wormy. Berries that were dried for winter supply were boiled when they were needed for consumption and were mixed with other foods to sweeten for taste. All berries were dried. Hides from animals were tanned and put to use for clothing or other uses such as bags, covers. Smaller animal hides were tanned and used for hats or other items. It was during the winter months that all repairs were done to the baskets and sewing for all the clothing. The men made all their supplies for the next year. They made new spears and bows, other things they needed to get food. They made their nets made of hemp. Each family had their regular places to stay and went there each year. Some of the materials and tools for hunting, gathering, and cooking included Indian hemp rope, twine for making fishing nets, antler or wooden digging sticks for digging bitterroot and camas, stone pounders for making flour from Metxu, sunflower seeds, twined cooking baskets. Water and hot rocks help to cook vegetables, roots, and dried meat. Bows and arrows for hunting game, both small and large. Indian hemp nets were held to the bottom of the water with stones or fishing weights. Knives and arrow points, spearheads, could be knapped or made from precious stones like obsidian. Salmon were speared from horseback or captured in weirs set across the river. Salmon season by Tilly Twagour. During the salmon season, Indian people gathered by the hundreds on the Wenatchee Flats. My father called this the Four Corners. All hands would gather for council and later to play and visit. Some marriages were formed here. They had horse races and they would gamble. Horse races ran almost hourly on a straight stretch measured up to 1 mile long. Winners would collect the wager consisting of personal belongings and treasures. They would pile blankets, furs, saddles, knives, traps, and tobacco. Some would even bet their horses. Buffalo robes and rifles were offered until the pile reached the height of about 6 feet high and about 20 to 30 feet wide at the bottom. Stick games would start and run for days at a time. Seasons of the People by Tilly Time Gore. Native people were nomadic and traveled following their food sources, gathering food and preparing it for the winter months. They had use for everything. Waste was not known to native people. Each item from the plants or animals had a purpose for their survival. Our people did things in a cycle throughout the year. There was a particular thing that needed to be done at a particular time. If you did not follow this cycle, you would not survive the harsh winters and may perish for not being prepared. January is the time of north wind, the time to repair and make new supplies for the following year. The children had this time for their in-depth schooling. This was the only time these stories and legends were told. Elders would say you did not talk about the spirits when they were awake. Only when they were asleep could you talk about them. Each year as the north wind blows, the children sat around the fires with their grandmothers and grandfathers. They listened to stories and legends told by the elders, for they were our teachers, our history book, since nothing was written. The elders had a way of teaching the young and holding their attention, knowing their attention span was very short at that age. For one example, they would hear the legend of Yellowbell, how she did not heed the warning of Lily and Violet and all the others about getting prepared for spring. Yellowbell was lazy and did not prepare her things so she would look beautiful when the Chinook winds came and Old Man Winter was gone for the year. They tell this is why you see the Yellowbell with her head hanging and her color is very faded and dull. These stories or legends were told by all bands and were similar in every way. How the Land Was Lost, from an interview with E. Richard Hart, author of Lost Homeland, the Methow Tribe and the Columbia Reservation. In 1879, members of the Methow Tribe lost their traditional territory, home to the Methow and their ancestors for thousands of years, through a transfer of land to the U.S. government that was negotiated without their consent. When Europeans first arrived in the region, the Methow lived along the Columbia and Okanagan rivers and in the Methow Valley, a bounteous breadbasket of traditional foods. In 1879, a presidential order established a reservation that fully encompassed the ancient territory of several tribes, including the Methow, but did not acknowledge the Methows' presence there. The Methow were left out of the process that determined their future. Creation of the Columbia or Moses Reservation was supported by Chief Moses of the Sincayuse Columbia tribe, who claimed to speak for the Methow and other affected tribes, but the Methow people were never consulted. 6 years after it was created, the Columbia Reservation was opened to non-Indian settlement, and the Methow people were given two choices: take allotments of 640 acres within their territory, or move to the Colville Reservation. The military was charged with telling all the Indians what their options were, but the military came to the Methow at a time of year when most of the people were higher up in the valley collecting berries and roots. As a result, most never knew of the opportunity to get allotments, and only a few Methow live on those allotments today. In 1886, when the reservation was opened to white settlement, most Methow were simply moved to the reservation and lost everything they had there. The Methow Tribe, then and now. Our mother tells of stories where she went to the Methow with their families when she was at the age of 12. They traveled by horse and buggy. She sometimes met with her grandfather in his canoe to spear salmon in the Columbia, then returning up the Methow River back to camp. Mother told many stories about her experiences and was happy to share with anyone that wanted to learn. This was her gift, the ability to share what she knew, so not to let things be forgotten and die out. She had seen too many take what they knew because of the epidemics, leaving no apprentice to carry on his or her trade. She made sure everything she knew she taught her children, and to anyone, really, who wanted to learn. When soldiers drove the people out of the Methow Valley, it was a horrible time in that century. Some were still cooking their meals on the fires when they were moved in front of the soldiers that were sent in there. Mothers' families were moved to the Chilliwack on the west side of the Okanagan River. They refused to cross the river to the reservation, so were homesteaded in that area. Since none of them could read or write, they did not understand the wording for the homestead. Thus they lost their land again. These bitter feelings stayed with our mother, and she carried them to her grave. Her stories still live on because she was willing to share and keep the stories alive, because her people did exist and the descendants still are living today. Thank you for being a part of this virtual tour of the Methow Valley Interpretive Center. We covered a lot of ground in a large span of time. Hope that you feel even more deeply connected to this place, to its first inhabitants, and to all those who call this place home. Kunlit Kuch Kich, and White.